Hi, we're the Pander brothers. I'm Jakob.
I'm Arnold.
And we just recently put out our independent feature film titled Altered Ego. It's a neo-noir suspense thriller, kind of in the tradition of a classic Hitchcock film, but with a kind of modern twist. Set in Portland, Oregon, about an architect who gets his identity stolen. And it's kind of a tale of hubris as this architect's life is picked apart by this spiteful identity thief. So what we thought we would do, since we've just got this movie out, is create a series of videos that really talk about the life cycle of making an independent film, from the initial idea all the way through to pre-production, production, and so on. And today, what we'd love to chat about is just that very kernel, the idea of getting an idea off the ground, where those ideas come from, that initial spark, and how that spark, that little ember, can slowly grow into a flame and hopefully a burning, fiery movie in the end. And so,
an inferno of awesome.
An inferno of awesomeness. So often, what really can kind of set things in motion for us are, the idea, well, there's three things that can kind of put something in motion. One is just an idea, a premise, like a science fiction premise. We're going to put this person in this situation and see what happens in this world. Another way is, really focusing on that the initial kernel might be the idea of an individual, and what spark, kind of sets that story in motion. So, you've got like the big idea can be the inspiration, or the story, the journey specifically can be the inspiration, or a scene, a set piece, a situation can really be the catalyst. And in the case of Altered Ego, it was that last one. It was a scene, it was a situation that was really the core initial piece that got things really driving for us. And that was basically
the catalyst.
Yeah. And it was a story, it was a situation that happened to our father. And so this is kind of a prime example of tapping into things that you either experience yourself or kind of encounter, in your life, or something that happened to a friend, something that kind of has got this visceral charge that feels like, wow, that could be developed into a scene. And it doesn't necessarily literally have to be that exact situation or setting, but it can kind of be the kernel of something that kind of sets something in motion in a totally different context. And so in this situation,
because if it sticks with you, it might stick with other people.
Well, yeah, exactly. So in this case, there was a situation that happened to our father in Eastern Oregon at the Pendleton Roundup, which is an annual rodeo that happens way out in Eastern Oregon in the kind of rural part of the state. And our father is an artist, or was a fine artist, and often carried around a sketchbook with him. And when he was in kind of public settings, he would just do life drawing, draw the landscape or draw a situation, draw people around him, draw friends at a party, but also just be in different kinds of environments and draw the scenes around him out on the street.
And it really became kind of an extension of him. It was really...
Yeah, it was very much a part of
his process and his personality.
Yeah. It was almost like a street photographer, but with a sketchbook instead. Which, as a street photographer, you just like pop off a shot and keep on cruising.
Yeah.
But when you're doing a drawing, it's going to take a little time. Yeah. And so our dad...
And it's a little... You can start to stand out, because you're sort of looking up and,
exactly. So our dad found himself sitting at probably, I think it was just a little, like a lunch, outdoor lunch spot during this rodeo. And, here he is, a guy from Europe. He's out in the West, in America, and in the Wild West, and he wants to draw the most kind of Wild West thing. There's this guy, this cowboy hat and a vest, and probably just had gotten off of being in the rodeo, and so our dad starts drawing this guy in a sketchbook. And of course, like Arnold's saying, you're kind of looking down and looking up and looking down and looking up, and you're really staring at this guy, and you're drawing and it's taking a while, and you got to really get that hat and that shade under his eyes and all that. And next thing he knows, he's like looking up, and this guy's walking up to him and gets right in his face, and he's like, "You looking at me? You drawing me? I give you permission to draw me?" And this
it got personal real fast.
Right in his
very,
face.
Very awkward and very confrontational. And, our father was sort of, tried to, I think, maybe reason with him a little bit, but this guy wasn't having it, and basically, demanded that our dad tear the drawing out of his book. And, and it was a sort of awkward, because of course our dad never does that. And, these are like bound sketchbooks that are almost journals in a way, and very personal to him. So, but it was a brief negotiation, I believe,
Yeah.
and he basically complied with this, pretty intimidating cowboy, and tore the drawing out and handed it to the stranger, and who proceeded to tear it up and basically leave it right there in front of our dad, turned and walked away. And it was a real sort of layered moment of kind of what would it be? The territory and
Yeah, it's
sort
kind
of
of
male
territory.
humiliation, or
Mhm.
our father
And
was humiliated, but he may have felt he was
being objectified and humiliated,
So there
and
was a lot of layers and dynamics there, but suffice to say, it was just a really unique moment between two really like people from opposite sides of the spectrum, so to speak, and they found themselves in this moment of kind of confrontation
yeah,
that luckily didn't accelerate any further, and that was that. But it stuck with our father. It was, probably to a degree was a traumatic experience. But it also became a family tale around. He would tell the story around the dinner table, and so for us it was one of those stories that was kind of ingrained in our kind of a family story. But at one point, and it was really Jakob that thought, hey, wow, wouldn't that be amazing to put that into kind of a modern context, maybe a slightly different set of circumstances, and out in Altered Ego, essentially we, the character of our protagonist, Dylan Gray, is a bit of a, um, you know, bit of a he's got a healthy ego, and he finds himself in an airport, which airports tend to be places where strangers interact. It's kind of this sort of neutral place where people from all walks of life might pass through. And so he, like our father, finds himself sitting, but with his designs and his architecture, and he's got his book, but it's still that same relationship to the sketchbook, and sort of drawing. He draws a flight attendant in he's drawing the environment. And then at one point, the flight attendant actually asks him to do a drawing, and points to an individual who's clearly having a bad day, who turns out to be our the kind of nemesis in the story, who is a professional criminal. But unbeknownst to our architect, he goes about doing this drawing, and somewhat unflattering to kind of a version of this individual, and then to impress the girl, and next thing he knows, the guy is approaching him. So we really took sort of the architecture or the anatomy of that
situation,
real world experience, and injected it into a fictional context.
yeah.
And it, obviously it goes on from there, but you get the general idea.
And so, in that it's finding something that you can kind of, it's like an anchor point. And as you're finding those little seeds of inspiration, and they don't have to be a big conflict either. They could be a very intimate, conflict or situation of loss or things that kind of have something in it that kind of sets or changes a situation, something that has some tension, some contrast in it. And in the end, that might be a scene that ends up in the middle of your story or towards the end of your story. So these ideas don't necessarily need to be in any kind of like, oh, I got to figure out the beginning of my story. This is really a much broader stage of just trying to find the world and hopefully find the characters within that world as you're starting to brainstorm those ideas.
And it's a kind of like the what if we did something with that moment, and and how could that what could that look like, and
what
so
could
you
happen?
start to ask these questions.
Where will this go?
Where will this go? Where could this go? And you do sort of begin to sculpt the idea, and it starts to take shape in a new way, and in its own way, beyond the source, if you will.
And then what I would say kind of the next thing that kind of comes into play in this process, so that's kind of an example, that type of a scene or situation. For us, really, the next thing that starts to bubble up is the broader theme. So in the case of that story, it was, about a kind of a confident, egocentric young architect who's making fun of somebody who is in a situation that is where they've just lost their job, and they're in a really different place in their situation. And that becomes kind of the catalyst about identity and drawing this other guy and who these two people are. And it turns out this guy is an identity thief and steals, as kind of payback for this situation, this scenario, steals our protagonist's identity, or starts to undo his identity, undo his world. And so the theme of identity starts to come into the play of our story making process and design idea. And so I think that starts to kind of spread the idea out further, and what other scenes could be created out of that search for and definition of the bigger theme that you are talking about. And the theme itself ultimately is your clues to the inner story, the inner world of your protagonist, and the transformation that protagonist is going to go through over the course
And the
of the story.
why do we want to tell this story? What is it about this individual that is compelling beyond this? This conflict is a catalyst for something bigger and deeper, and so that becomes, again, with this, the thematic focus around, ego, around identity, around self, and that doesn't have to be a negative thing necessarily, but it becomes a kind of a universal theme, that, in this story, the focus is around a kind of, borderline narcissism, also, an individual who, in the case of our protagonist Dylan, is in a certain place at a certain time, at this sort of peak moment of kind of, career opportunity, and then he's sort of crossing paths with an individual who's having a kind of polar opposite, like Jakob said, a kind of a real extreme contrast. So these are two real human experiences, but in terms of the trajectory of where it goes, it becomes this opportunity to tell a story about an individual who really is, going through. There's a bigger kind of life arc or narrative arc of his story, of Dylan's story, about someone who's going through a kind of a, not identity crisis, but a kind of
It's like confronting a necessary change.
It's a necessary change. This is a symptom of something bigger in his life, that he's this behavior that he's exhibiting at this point. How he's processing his success is through his ego and through a sort of narcissistic behavior, which he has to atone for, or has to contend with when it blows up in his face. And so the whole thing is, it does act as a cautionary tale, but it also acts as a kind of a theme of, that's hopefully universal, that we could all find ourselves in a place. We all go through phases that can ultimately be, the trigger for your destiny.
Yeah, exactly. So, in that's like kind of starting to look at the character side of things, and what might be the kind of the moral arc or the morality play that's within the setting that you're creating and the situations that you're creating. Then kind of pulling out a little further, oftentimes you'll find yourself telling stories about a particular culture, particular institutional environment, so in the case of this story, it was about architects and architecture and the development world. And this is something that we, admire and have drawn to, the beauty and the kind of potency of certain, types of architecture, but don't necessarily know the inner workings of how these things are being financed, and what are all the deals, and how is this kind of inner world happening in terms
The
of
culture
industry
and the language and the vernacular.
Exactly. So basically, research is a really big component at a certain point in terms of being able to develop authenticity and believability within your story. So I think that that's like a stage that's really crucial. And, it doesn't have to be what you're doing at the very, very beginning, but I do think it's pretty good to do
I
it
think it's,
fairly early
I
on
mean,
to help.
it's just as simple as Googling. I mean, in the sense of
Yeah.
like, okay, we've got these big themes. We have a general idea, and we like the idea that this character is an architect, and really start to kind of, again, this is feeding into the brainstorm session, but we'll get it to that next. But is a kind of a sense of developing a feel for the world that you want to express, and so it starts to kind of inform, and give you more building blocks in a way, so that your imagination, might have a sort of, parameter on it of, oh, okay, what do we know about architects? From, okay, yeah, we, certain periods of architecture, but that doesn't mean we know about that architect, individual architects, or where some of that inspiration came from for that, for Art Deco or something. So these kind of, when you kind of Google it or just do a little bit of research, it does help to kind of just give you a little more foundational support around, this sort of imagination, element, this piece where it's very ephemeral. And so all this to say, whether it's this experiential side of story, whether it's a theme that you start to kind of feel passionate about, that could tie into, that event, there's a sort of harmony between them, and then a little bit of research to kind of go, okay, well, now that I have these themes and elements in place, and I'm going to kind of fortify myself with some insight around that. It starts to kind of give you a sense of, not on a total authority on it, but you're starting to feel like this is a kind of an ownership of the idea, and
Yeah.
and the tangibility from this ephemeral space to something that starts to feel more like I can start to see it.
Yeah, and I would say it also can open up new ideas.
That too.
Once you have a sense of the world in which these folks truly inhabit, then oftentimes new ideas can spring out of that, or just even nuances of scenes, in terms of how you're going to have a scene play out. So it's just, it's more, it just gives you more ammunition, to really be able to start to tell that story, and feel like it's flowing out of yourself from an authentic
Right.
place.
And to that point, this sort of, now that you're kind of getting a handle on the concept overall, you start to become a receiver. You start to kind of, I think at one point you made the analogy of, if you have a red car, you start to see red cars. Like you kind of, are in a frequency of the themes that you're dealing with and the subject matter, and you start to, the key is to be aware of that, take notice of those things when they present themselves, and sometimes there's no way around it. You just start to see things that are connected to that. And one example would be, because we, would take road trips and a lot of drives from Portland to LA, and so a lot of occasional rest areas. And at one point, just randomly, like looking in a one of those funky mirrors that's like, that don't even really function, that don't even reflect
they're
anything.
basically like made out of stainless steel, and
Yeah,
they come in and clean them with some scouring pad until they don't reflect an image
There's
anymore.
nothing there to see, and so you sort of are looking at yourself, and there's no one there,
Some distorted image,
some kind of
Yeah.
blurry, murky, distorted image, and so you're kind of like, well, there's something existential about that. There's something powerful about that, the banality of it, and kind of like
So
seeing
this is
it
something.
through the eyes.
This became
A kind of like that's something, we need to do something with that, and it was like, take note. And so at one point, and I don't even know where in the midst of all this, it was just that image stood out, and I remember we kind of went, remember that time with that mirror, and it really fit with this theme.
We got to put this in the story, right?
Identity, and if someone loses their identity, who are they? And then those themes that start to expand, like, ooh, okay, now we're getting into this deeper psychological space. So things can, trigger other ideas because they sort of represent something, but it fits into this, this place, this space you're creating, and then all of a sudden, it's like, you've just opened up a new doorway, and the inspiration goes from there. So those are some, fundamental elements.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing that we really like to do really early on is establish the names of all the characters. And I think sometimes there's a tendency when you're really in the early stage of brainstorming is to kind of go, oh, the man or the woman or the fiance or the son or the detective, and you kind of you really are operating in this very archetypal space of when you're just kind of generating these ideas. And in the past, sometimes we would let that really linger like that for quite a while. But we came to realize that by naming those characters really very early in the process, it had a really profound effect on just connecting and empathizing with those characters as you were developing them. So that's one of those things
Making
that
them
we like to
human.
do right away is just give everybody names. Those names might change as you develop it, but they do then when you start referring to them, they're really referring to a person. So, we're referring to Dylan in our movie, or we're referring to Janine, his fiance. And as time develops, and you are indeed getting to know them as you're writing and developing the concepts, that's a really, really powerful thing to do really early on.
And again, it's like you start owning it. You start owning the ideas. You start owning the themes. You start owning the characters within it, and it in a way it starts to become real.
Yeah, yeah. So at this point, you're at a point at this stage where you've got these big general ideas. I mean, there's basically kind of clay at maybe several wheels that's forming, and but you feel like you've got something that's exciting you. It is lighting a flame. It's something that you feel like this could be a real, a feature film. There's enough here that this could be a big story to tell, or at least a full 3-act structure.
But where does it go
100
from here?
Yeah, but then how do you kind of get that to that next stage to actually get that turned into that big story and into a cohesive story? So we're gonna share some of those ideas in this next video here on brainstorming, the treatment, and how we go about the process of getting the story actually formed into a true 3-act structure and a movie script.